picture this. You are an American or a British traveler, right?
Yeah.
And you're walking down this bustling street in 1970s Iran.
Oh, setting the scene. I like it.
Yeah, so it's hot, the markets are loud, and suddenly, this local man making his way through the crowd catches your eye and yells out, "Mister!" Just that, Mister.
Right.
How do you react? Because if you look at the travelogues and diaries from Westerners during that era, their reaction was almost universally annoyance.
Yeah, highly offended.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They wrote down that Iranians were, quote, distinctly cheeky, like they felt actively insulted.
Which is so funny in hindsight.
It is. Now, hold that thought and picture another scenario. You're in the city of Mashhad visiting a local druggist.
Okay.
And the shop owner has this young apprentice working for him. But the owner keeps 0 accounting books. No receipts, no ledger, nothing.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Right. So you ask the owner, aren't you worried he's stealing from the register? And the owner replies, oh, I know for an absolute fact he is stealing from me.
Just completely casual.
Totally casual. You ask why he doesn't fire the kid, and the owner smiles and says, fire him. He is the best apprentice I've ever had.
It creates this profound sense of cognitive dissonance for an outsider.
I mean, yeah, I'd be completely baffled.
You have a traveler who feels deeply insulted by what is actually a standard polite greeting, and you have a business owner who is, like, singing the praises of an employee he knows is actively robbing him.
Yeah, it makes no sense on the surface.
Right. And when we encounter situations like this, whether we're traveling abroad or even just, navigating a different corporate culture, our brains scramble for an explanation. We desperately want to know why people are behaving in ways that seem entirely irrational to us.
And the explanation we almost always land on is a psychological one, isn't it?
Almost without fail.
We assume they have a collective personality trait. We say the people on the street are cheeky or rude, or we say the business culture is inherently corrupt.
Right, we pathologize it.
Exactly. We get this visceral feeling about the collective personality of the group, and we write it down as a solid, undeniable fact. It's a very human instinct to categorize people that way.
Yeah, it's what we call national character or company culture.
We assume that because a group of people acts a certain way, they must all inherently feel a certain way or, possess a specific moral failing.
Which is the ultimate trap.
The ultimate trap.
Yeah, because we crave a way to predict behavior.
Yeah.
If we can label an entire demographic as naturally suspicious or inherently emotional, it saves us the exhausting work of trying to decode what is actually happening.
And what is actually happening?
Well, what's actually happening in these moments has nothing to do with a shared psychological mindset.
Uh-huh.
What we are really looking at, and what outsiders almost always fail to decode, is a highly complex underlying system of communication.
Okay, let's unpack this because that is the mission for today's deep dive. We are going to dismantle everything you thought you knew about the stereotypes of different cultures.
It's going to be a fun one.
Definitely. To do this, we are unpacking a fascinating sociolinguistic paper written in 1976 by William O. Beeman. It's titled, What is Iranian National Character? A Sociolinguistic Approach.
A classic in the field.
Yeah. And Beeman was looking specifically at Iran in the 1970s, but the mechanics of what he uncovers, they apply to any situation where you are forced to interact with a group of people whose unspoken rules you just do not understand.
Absolutely. We are moving away from psychology, and we are diving headfirst into sociolinguistics.
So where does Beeman start?
Well, his core argument fundamentally shows how we should view human interaction. He argues that this persistent idea of a national character, this illusion that a population shares deep psychological regularities, is actually an artifact of the observer's ignorance.
Ouch. The observer's ignorance.
Yeah, it's a bit harsh, but it's true. The observer is looking at how people talk, how they handle transactions, how they express anger, and instead of recognizing that these people are operating under a different set of communication rules, the observer basically diagnoses a personality disorder.
They misapply their own cultural assessments to a communication system they simply do not grasp.
Exactly.
Let's start with that illusion because it is incredibly pervasive. Beeman talks about how this concept of national character doggedly maintains its intuitive appeal in the social sciences.
It's so hard to shake.
Even when modern researchers try to repudiate it and say, no, you can't paint an entire nation with one psychological brush, the idea still lingers. Why is it so hard for us to let go of the idea that a society has a collective ethos?
Because the regularity we observe with our own eyes is real.
Right.
When you watch a different society or even just a different corporate department, you genuinely do see patterns of behavior repeating.
Mhm.
People tend to react to the same stimuli in the same ways.
So we aren't hallucinating the patterns.
No, not at all. The mistake isn't in seeing the pattern. The mistake is in diagnosing the underlying cause of that pattern.
Okay.
Beeman brings in the work of the anthropologist Margaret Mead here to offer an alternative framework.
Oh, Margaret Mead, yeah.
Yeah. She suggested that instead of looking at psychology, we should view these broad patterns as an analytic interpretation of communication systems.
Okay, so a communication system.
Right. And it is vital to understand that a communication system is not just the vocabulary people use. It encompasses patterns of both linguistic and non-linguistic behavior.
So body language and stuff too.
Yes. It's the words, yes, but it's also the silence, the physical distance between speakers, the gestures, the timing of the delivery, and the context in which a message is delivered.
Which means that even within a single country, those patterns are going to splinter into 1,000 different variations.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you wouldn't expect a Wall Street investment banker and an Alaskan crab fisherman to operate with the exact same social rulebook.
Right, even if they both technically speak American English.
Exactly. They might use the same dictionary, but the way they use silence or the way they express disagreement is going to be wildly different.
That distinction right there brings us to a foundational sociolinguistic concept that Beeman draws upon. He references scholars like David Smith and Del Himes. To understand the rest of the paper, we really have to understand the difference between a language community and a speech community.
Okay, break that down for us. What's a language community?
A language community is simply a group of individuals who share the same linguistic codes. They know the grammar, they understand the referential quality of the speech.
Like vocabulary.
Exactly. If someone says the word tree, everyone in that community knows what physical, leafy object is being referred to.
So they speak the same language. That part is straightforward.
But a speech community goes much further.
Okay.
Members of a speech community share the linguistic codes, but they also share the rules for using those codes. They share the rules for interpreting them.
Oh, I see.
Sharing a language absolutely does not mean you share the rules for its use.
Let me map this onto something most people have experienced. Think about playing a massive multiplayer online video game.
Oh, good analogy.
Sharing the language community is knowing the mechanical controls. You know that pressing the X button makes your avatar jump. You know the left trigger aims your weapon. Everyone who bought the game shares that language.
Right, the basic mechanics.
But sharing the speech community is knowing the unspoken etiquette of the player base. It's knowing that if you encounter an enemy player who is clearly glitching out or whose internet connection has dropped and they're just standing there frozen, you don't shoot them.
Yeah, that's just bad form.
It's not written in the game's official manual. The code allows you to shoot them. But the rule of use within that specific community dictates that taking advantage of a disconnected player is dishonorable.
Exactly.
If you shoot them, you are communicating something terrible about yourself to the other players, even though you just pressed a button that the game allows you to press.
That's spot on. Taking that game analogy a step further, knowing the vocabulary or the button layout isn't enough to survive in the community. You have to know the rules for the association of particular modes of speaking, topics, or message forms with particular settings.
So context is everything.
Everything. Linguistic codes do not themselves constitute speech. They are merely the raw materials for producing speech forms. It is the community that dictates what forms are appropriate, where they are appropriate, and when they are appropriate.
And Beeman points out that these rules dictate far more than just politeness, right? Like, they dictate how you are allowed to present your internal emotional states to the outside world.
They do. A broad system of communication includes prescriptive appropriateness criteria.
Prescriptive appropriateness criteria, that's a mouthful.
It is, but basically it dictates comprehensible ways you can show that you are, for example, angry. It provides a culturally legible template for anger and simultaneously prohibits other ways of showing anger that won't be interpreted correctly by the group. Communication systems are the mechanism by which individuals regularize their own behavior to remain legible to their peers.
Okay, let me push back on this a little bit because this feels like a semantic trick.
Okay, let's hear it.
If a cultural system is dictating exactly how everyone should act, when they are allowed to show anger, and when they must hide it, and everyone in that society is following those exact rules and acting uniformly, isn't that practically indistinguishable from a shared personality?
I see where you're going.
Like, if the output is the same, why does it matter if we call it a communication rule rather than a psychological trait?
It matters immensely because confusing the two leads to catastrophic misinterpretations.
Mm-hmm.
Uniformity in behavior does not equal uniform character, nor does it equal uniform internal emotions.
Oh, interesting.
What you are observing is uniform codes of communication. Behind those standardized codes, there is a vast, hidden ocean of individual, attitudinal, and emotional variation.
So they aren't all feeling the same thing.
Not at all. You could have 10 people in a room acting in perfect accordance with a specific cultural etiquette. To an outsider, they look like a monolith.
Right.
But internally, one person is seething with rage, another is overjoyed, a third is bored to tears, and a fourth is battling severe anxiety. The uniform behavior is just a socially agreed upon framework they are using to operate in that specific setting. It is a tool, not a mirror of their soul.
So if the character that an outsider sees is actually just a complex set of communication rules, what happens when someone who doesn't know the rules tries to analyze the situation?
They're going to get it completely wrong.
And this leads us to the mechanism of how these stereotypes are born, which we might call the observer's trap.
Yeah, the observer's trap. When an observer encounters a communicative rule they do not understand, they rarely just throw their hands up and say, I'm confused.
We don't like being confused.
No, human nature abhors a vacuum of meaning. So we create explanatory statements. But, as Beeman points out, any generalized interpretive statement about human behavior relies on a system of coordinates that lies outside the observed system.
Meaning, we use our own cultural ruler to measure someone else's house.
Beautifully put. The explanation an outsider generates says significantly more about the world of the observer than it does about the world of the observed.
Beeman brings back Margaret Mead here to provide a concrete historical example of this trap in action. She looked at the Western analysis of Russian child-rearing practices.
Specifically, the traditional practice of tightly swaddling infants for prolonged periods.
Yeah. This swaddling example perfectly isolates the difference between a psychological caricature and a sociolinguistic view.
It really does.
Oh.
So an outside observer, say, an American or British sociologist, looks at a Russian infant bound tightly in cloth. The observer references their own cultural coordinates, which highly value physical autonomy and individual freedom from birth. Based on those coordinates, the observer generates a caricature statement. Swaddling them as infants makes Russians incapable of freedom.
Wow. That's a huge leap.
It is. They assign a permanent psychological outcome, an inherent subservience or incapacity for liberty, to a physical child-rearing practice.
They bypass any structural explanation and jump straight to diagnosing the entire nation's soul.
Exactly. But Mead offers the counter-perspective. She argues that prolonged and tight swaddling is actually one of the means by which Russians communicate to their infants a feeling that a strong authority is necessary.
Oh, so it's a message.
Yes. The swaddling isn't designed to break the child's spirit. It is a communicative act within their specific cultural system. It is the parent using a physical medium to transmit a cultural value about authority and structure to the infant.
Which brings us back to the traveler on the street in 1970s Iran, the American who gets yelled at.
Right. The Mr. guy.
Exactly. The local says, Mr., and the American writes in his diary that the locals are cheeky. What is the actual sociolinguistic breakdown happening in that millisecond of interaction?
The discrepancy lies entirely in the rules for usage. The observer hears the phonetic sound, Mr. Because they recognize the linguistic code, they immediately apply the English rules for how that word is used.
Right. And in English, yelling Mr. at a stranger on the street is abrupt.
It's abrupt, perhaps a bit confrontational or overly familiar. But the speaker is not using the English rulebook. The speaker is translating the Persian address form aga, which translates to sir or Mr., but possesses an entirely different set of usage rules in Iranian culture.
Okay, so how is aga used?
Aga can be used to politely hail someone, to show respect, or to initiate an interaction across a crowded space. The speaker is applying Persian communicative rules to an English vocabulary word.
So the message that was intended by the sender is entirely disconnected from the message received by the listener. It is a complete transmission failure.
A total failure.
But instead of recognizing the failure, The receiver blames the sender's personality. It's like sitting down to play a game of chess with someone, but you're playing by the rules of checkers.
Oh, that's good.
When the other player moves their knight in an L shape, you don't realize they are following a different rule book. You just assume they are a cheating, dishonest person.
And that assumption of dishonesty was rampant in early Western literature about Iran. Beeman cites a writer named Edward Brown, who noted in 1927 that Europeans traveling in Persia frequently complained about the meanness, the sordid greed of the locals.
Sordid greed. Wow.
Yeah. The context for this judgment was a specific type of interaction. A local Persian might approach a European and offer them a present, but would subsequently expect money in return.
Well, yeah, to a European, a gift is a gift. The rule of a gift is that it is free, and it comes with no immediate financial strings attached.
Right.
So the European feels cheated. They think, you offered me a gift, but now you're demanding payment. You are greedy and deceitful.
But Brown, acting as a more astute observer, realized the Europeans were fundamentally misreading the transaction.
What were they missing?
Brown pointed out that this complaint arises from a total failure to understand the communicative fact of the interaction. In that specific cultural context, when a man of a distinctly lower social rank offers a present to someone of a significantly higher rank, like a wealthy foreign traveler, it is not a gift in the Western sense.
Then what is it?
It is tantamount to a formal declaration that he is willing to sell the article in question.
Oh, it's a sales pitch.
Yes. It is an opening to a commercial transaction, politely coded to navigate the steep status difference between the two individuals. Brown astutely noted that a European has no more right to blame a poor Persian for expecting equivalent value for his present than he has to censure a cab driver in London or New York who expresses a desire to be remembered with a tip.
That makes so much sense. It's a sales pitch draped in the required etiquette of the social hierarchy. If we don't understand the rules of the game we are playing, we are going to constantly misinterpret the moves of the people around us.
Constantly.
Which brings us to the first major behavioral trait that outsiders consistently misidentified in 1970s Iran, the myth of uncertainty.
Ah, yes, uncertainty.
Westerners frequently described life in Iran as chaotic, insecure, and profoundly uncertain. They looked at individuals who seemed to fluctuate wildly between opposed sets of values, and they diagnosed a psychological inability to commit.
Right, because to an outsider whose own culture directs them to think in unambiguous, one-dimensional terms where a contract is a contract and a rule is a rule, this constant fluctuation looks like manifest uncertainty.
It looks as though the people don't know what they stand for.
But Beeman introduces a communication principle formulated by a researcher named Kielstra to explain what is actually happening. Kielstra argues for a dialectic approach to understanding Iranian social dynamics.
Meaning what, practically speaking?
It means that the system operates on a twofold principle. First, messages and actions cannot be interpreted according to any single set of criteria. Every action exists in a web of competing values.
Okay.
Second, and most importantly, an adroit operator, a skilled communicator within this culture, never settles on a final interpretation of any message.
They never settle on a final interpretation. That is so deeply alien to a Western bureaucratic mindset that desperately wants to lock down the facts, put them in a spreadsheet, and move on.
Exactly. What looks like psychological uncertainty or flakiness to the outsider is, in reality, a highly predictable and necessary flexibility. The individuals are not uncertain. They are meticulously keeping their options open because the context is always shifting.
Beeman provides a case study from a village he resided in that illustrates this dialectic approach perfectly. It involves the village Kadkuda, which is the official government representative of the village.
It's such a great story.
The village had a massive problem. They needed to select a new Kadkuda, but every available option violated someone's core interests.
The conflict was rooted in the socio-economic reality of the village. The vast majority of the villagers were small landowners and day laborers. They were economically vulnerable.
Right.
Therefore, they desperately needed a representative who would protect them and not misrepresent their interests when dealing with the regional government. They needed a shield.
Makes sense.
However, they also recognized a competing necessity. They needed an individual who was powerful, effective, and crucially, wealthy enough to entertain urban officials when those officials occasionally visited the village.
Right, because if a government official visits, you can't just offer them a cup of tea in a modest hut. You need a representative with a large home, resources, and the social standing to host them properly. It's a matter of village prestige and political survival.
But here is the trap. The very few individuals in the village who were powerful and wealthy enough to deal with the government were the large landowners. And as a historical group, these large landowners had consistently proven to be extraordinarily adept at manipulating village land allocation and economic affairs to their own advantage, almost always to the severe detriment of the small landowners.
So the small landowners are caught in an impossible bind. They need a wealthy champion to deal with the outside world, but if they give a wealthy man official government power over the village, he will inevitably exploit them.
Exactly.
How on earth do you resolve a situation where any definitive choice leads to ruin?
The village resolved it through a masterpiece of sociolinguistic flexibility. Instead of forcing a vote and declaring a single winner, two different men simultaneously came to be known as the Kudkuda.
Two of them operating at the exact same time.
Yes. Depending entirely on the context and the nature of the conversation, either one or the other would be referred to as the official representative.
That's wild. What did the government think?
Well, the regional government, located in the city of Shiraz, refused to officially confirm either man. They recognized that both men were unacceptable for different bureaucratic or political reasons.
But the villagers didn't care what Shiraz thought. They refused to select anyone else. They forced the ambiguity into existence.
Precisely. They maintained the state of official limbo. And when regional government officials actually traveled to the village, those officials were forced to adapt to the village's system.
Oh, wow.
They dealt with both men on an unofficial basis, choosing which one to interact with depending on the specific nature of the business being transacted.
It's Schrodinger's village official.
Yes.
To an outside observer who needs a binary yes or no, answers someone who has an organizational chart and needs to know definitively who is at the top, it looks like utter chaos.
Oh, totally. An outsider would ask 4 different villagers who the mayor is and get 4 different answers. They would write in their notebook, "These people are so disorganized and uncertain."
But to the villagers, the system works perfectly fine in a state of superposition. They haven't failed to make a choice. They have actively chosen not to collapse the wave function because maintaining the ambiguity is the only way to balance the competing power dynamics.
And significantly, the 2 men acting as the unofficial Kadkuda were perfectly content to leave the issue unresolved. Becoming the sole official would certainly increase their individual status, but living in this limbo allowed them to tacitly acknowledge each other's authority in different contexts without having to force a rigid binary confrontation that might destroy the village's delicate social fabric.
So the truth of who was in charge depended entirely on the communicative context of the moment.
Yes, exactly.
If society is truly that fluid, where a village can operate with 2 mayors and the truth shifts based on who is standing in the room, how does an individual survive without constantly being taken advantage of?
You had to be quick on your feet.
Yeah, you would need a highly specialized defense mechanism. You would need incredible social agility to manage perceptions. Which brings us to the second major trait that outsiders observe and mislabel: the concept of zirangi.
Zirangi is a fascinating concept. In Western literature, it is often translated as cleverness, wiliness, or even cunning.
It sounds a bit sneaky.
It does. Observers frequently view it as a slightly negative, manipulative psychological trait. They see people constantly maneuvering and they assume it stems from a place of inherent deceit. But Beeman reframes zirangi sociolinguistically. It is not a character flaw. It is a required operational skill.
How does he define it in terms of communication?
He states that zirangi is an operation on the part of an adroit communicator that involves 2 simultaneous actions. First, you must thwart the direct interpretation of your own actions, or deliberately lead others to an erroneous interpretation. You must mask your true intent.
Okay, mask your intent.
Second, while you are doing that, you must successfully read and interpret the masked actions of others. It is the active, conscious manipulation of the codes we have been discussing.
But the paper is careful to note that this isn't necessarily driven by malicious sociopathic intent, right? It sounds like Machiavellian manipulation, but the reality on the ground is different.
Very different. While it can be used for self-interest, it frequently incorporates aspects of genuine altruism. A person uses ziranga to create a disposition on the part of others to interpret communication in a particular favorable way.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, you might use it to ingratiate yourself, to ensure a request is granted, or, very commonly, to forestall negative behavioral acts like verbal abuse or emotional devastation. You use cleverness to manage the emotional fallout of reality.
Beeman provides an incredible anecdote about a high school student that perfectly illustrates the mechanics and the stakes of ziranga. Let's dive into this because it highlights just how drastically different the moral evaluation of truth-telling can be.
The story centers on a young man from the village who attended high school in the city of Shiraz. By all accounts from the village, he was not a particularly bright student.
Right.
However, he had a massive incentive to graduate. He had been promised that upon receiving his diploma, he would be allowed to marry his pretty cousin, which also meant securing a good dowry and solidifying his social standing within the extended family network.
The stakes are incredibly high for him. If he fails out of high school, he loses the marriage, the dowry, and his reputation.
Everything.
And the reality is, he's failing. So how does a person utilizing zirangi handle this impending disaster?
He doesn't confess, and he doesn't just forge a diploma at the last minute. He executes a multi-year strategy of misdirection.
A multi-year strategy.
Yes. First, he changed high schools every single year. This ensured that no one in his village network ever quite knew which specific school administration to contact to check up on his progress. Second, he would bring his report cards home at highly irregular times. His parents never knew when the grading periods ended, so they couldn't anticipate when to ask for his results.
He is methodically dismantling their ability to anticipate his failure. He's controlling the flow of information to maintain a specific interpretation of his status, namely, that he is a functioning student.
Exactly. Over the course of several years, he managed to convince his parents that he'd actually graduated. In reality, he had utterly failed his final examinations. He hadn't even advanced to the final class.
Wow.
But his zirangi didn't stop at the lie. Before his parents were eventually informed of the truth in a completely unexpected manner, he had already used his perceived status as a graduate to marry his cousin, collect the dowry, and subsequently enlist in the army.
Let's pause and look at this from a Western perspective. In my culture, if a child lied to their parents for years about failing school, manipulated their way into a marriage under false pretenses, and stole a dowry, the revelation of that lie would permanently destroy trust within the family. It would be viewed as a massive, unforgivable betrayal.
Absolutely.
What happened when this young man's parents found out the truth?
Initially, there was enormous irritation. His parents and the uncle whose daughter he married were furious.
As you would be.
Right. But the aftermath is where we see the sociolinguistic rulebook in action. Eventually, the parents were convinced by their neighbors and relatives that the young man's extraordinary zirangi in orchestrating the whole matter more than offset his lack of filial duty.
Wait. They forgave him because they were impressed by the execution of the lie.
Essentially, yes. Because look at the outcome he engineered. He was now married, he has secured a good dowry, and he had used his momentum to gain a respectable position in the army. He had secured his future and, by extension, brought stability to the family unit.
Oh, I see.
The neighbors argued that a boy with that much cleverness and ability to navigate social systems was going to be successful in life, diploma or no diploma. And crucially, Beeman notes the young man's internal psychological state. He did not feel he had maliciously deceived his parents.
Really? He didn't feel bad.
No, because he knew early on he couldn't pass the exams. He simply wanted to arrange matters so they wouldn't have to experience the immediate pain, embarrassment, and chaos of his failure at the time it was happening.
Think about how we do this in micro ways in modern corporate life.
All the time.
If you are managing a project that is failing, you rarely send an email to the CEO that just says, "We failed." You soften the blow. You talk about pivoting strategies or unforeseen market headwinds. You manage the truth to manage their emotional reaction.
Exactly.
This student just did it on a massive, life-altering scale. And there's another example in the paper that deals with this kind of protective emotional management, the reluctance to send telegrams.
Telegrams were a fascinating communicative flashpoint. Beeman observed that some Iranians he knew would flatly refuse to send a telegram to their relatives if they were delayed in traveling home. When asked why, one man explained, "If I telegraph my mother and tell her I am delayed, she will immediately assume that I am near death."
Because in that specific cultural context, the medium is the message. A telegram implies extreme urgency, and urgency implies a catastrophic disruption of the norm.
Precisely. The communicative habit, the expected rule of interaction, is that bad news must be revealed in stages. You never deliver an unvarnished traumatic truth all at once.
So what does he do instead?
To spare his mother the agonizing anticipation of receiving progressively more alarming telegrams, he chooses to send nothing at all. He knows she will interpret the lack of communication as he is well and will arrive as expected, just perhaps a bit late. He's anticipating her interpretation and modifying his communication to prevent her distress.
The paper even mentions a famous 1969 Iranian film, Gov, or The Cow, which explores the tragic consequences of this protective mechanism.
Yeah, that film's a perfect example.
A villager goes away to the city, and while he is gone, his beloved cow, his most prized possession, dies. The villagers know how deeply attached he is, so when he returns, they refuse to tell him the cow died. They use zirangi. They tell him the cow straight away and is lost.
They're trying to soften the blow.
They are trying to break the news in stages, to let him process the absence before delivering the finality of death. But the delay in the ultimate truth ends up driving the man insane. He cannot process the limbo, and he assumes the identity of the lost cow.
It's so sad.
It is. It's a brilliant, tragic exploration of a cultural rule functioning exactly as intended, but with disastrous results.
It underscores how deeply embedded this rule of communication is. You mediate reality to protect the social fabric.
But this raises a massive logistical question for me.
Okay, what is it?
If everyone in society knows that everyone else is actively managing the truth, thwarting direct interpretation, and using zirangi, why doesn't the entire society collapse into absolute anarchy? If I know you are lying to me to protect my feelings, and you know I know you are lying, how does anything get done?
It would lead to anarchy if the society were structurally flat.
Structurally flat.
Yeah, if everyone was equal.
Whoa.
But it is not. The system of cleverness and managed truth functions precisely because it operates within an incredibly rigid, highly differentiated framework of social status. And that brings us to the third major trait observers note: the complex dynamics of authority, submission, and autonomy.
To understand this, Beeman quotes a British statesman named George Curzon who traveled through Persia in 1892. Curzon observed that an individual could be, at different moments in the same day, haughty and cringing, while always maintaining a certain aloofness from the world.
Right.
To a British aristocrat, that sounds like a bizarre, contradictory personality. How can you be arrogant and submissive at the same time?
It is only a contradiction if you view haughty and cringing as static personality traits that an individual carries with them at all times. But if you view them sociolinguistically, it makes perfect sense.
How so?
The communication pattern underlying this behavior partitions society into strict networks based on status. You are just communicating a message. You are communicating from a very specific, mutually understood rung on a social ladder. Your behavior is dictated entirely by where you stand relative to the person you are talking to.
So it's very hierarchical.
Very. Beeman outlines three main status positions that dictate these interactions.
Let's break these down, because this is the invisible architecture holding the whole society together. What is the first tier?
The first position governs interactions between intimates. In this inner circle, the rules change entirely. There is no ta'aruf.
And we should define ta'aruf for those unfamiliar. It is the incredibly complex, nuanced system of ritual courtesy and politeness in Persian culture, where you might refuse an offer several times before accepting, or offer something you don't actually intend to give as a show of ultimate respect.
Exactly. But between true intimates, close family, lifelong friends, the heavy code is dropped. Genuine respect does not require these coded formal forms.
You can just be direct.
Yes. Requests are made absolutely and unequivocally. You don't ask politely, you simply state the need. Material goods are ideally treated as common property. And at its deepest level, this is the sphere where one person would willingly sacrifice themselves for the other. The protective barriers of zirangi are largely unnecessary here because the mutual trust is absolute.
Okay, that's the inner sanctum. What is the second position?
The second involves non-intimates of unequal status. This is where someone is clearly higher or lower than you on the social ladder: a boss and an employee, a wealthy landowner and a day laborer, an elder and a youth. This space is heavily coded. It absolutely requires ta'aruf. Even if you do not genuinely respect the person, you must perform the respectful code forms.
You have to wear the uniform of politeness.
Yes. And crucially, the interpretation of an action changes completely based on who is performing it. If you give a material good or perform an action for someone of higher status, the culture interprets that act as a petition, a tribute, or a required service.
Okay.
But if the person of higher status performs the exact same action for someone of lower status, it is interpreted as an order, a reward, or a gracious favor.
Wow. So the exact same action has opposite meanings.
The relative status dictates the meaning of the act. This perfectly explains Curzon's observation. You are haughty to those below you, issuing orders and expecting service. And an hour later, you are cringing or submitting with deep ritual respect to a government official above you, offering petitions and tribute.
You aren't crazy, you are just following the rules of the hierarchy.
Exactly.
It's a vertical ladder, and your behavior flips depending on whether you are looking up or looking down. Which brings us to the third position, which I think is the most volatile and fascinating space.
The third position involves non-intimates of equal status. This is the trickiest space to navigate. If you are not intimates, and neither of you is clearly higher or lower in status than the other, the rules imply autonomy.
Okay, autonomy.
And in this specific system, autonomy implies that there is no necessary communication whatsoever.
To help Westerners understand this, Beeman brings in the work of Edward Hall, an anthropologist who studied proxemics, the physical distance limits in communication.
Oh yeah, this is a great comparison.
Hall pointed out that the physical space between two people dictates the type of communication that is possible. You do not whisper sweet endearments at a distance of 20 feet. And you do not deliver a booming, aggressive sermon to someone standing 2 inches from your nose.
Right, the physical distance constrains the behavior.
Beeman argues that in Iran, relative status acts exactly like physical distance. It is a limiting structural constraint on communication. It is structurally impossible to be haughty with a clear superior, just as it is physically impossible to whisper across a football field. The constraints are placed on the communication itself, not on the psychological desires of the people.
So if you take two individuals of equal status who are not intimates, and you put them in a room and ask them to collaborate on a project.
It's like trying to push the two north poles of a magnet together.
Yes.
They repel. There is no structural, cultural mechanism for them to interact smoothly without one of them either taking charge or submitting.
That is exactly what happens. Beeman notes that this feature of the communication system perfectly explains a widespread, frustrated observation among Western managers and sociologists working in Iran at the time. The claim that Iranians cannot work together in groups.
Oh, because they don't know who is in charge.
When set on a common task, those involved are continually vying for status positions. They argue, they boast, they try to outmaneuver each other. Why? Because if there is no clear vertical hierarchy established, there is no clear way to proceed in the interaction. The horizontal, equal status space has no rules for cooperation. They have to fight to establish who is higher and who is lower before the actual work can even begin.
So let's synthesize this environment. You live in a society where you constantly have to gauge the exact status of the person you're talking to. You have to adjust your level of haughtiness or submission on the fly. You know they might be using zirangi to mask their true motives, and you have to use zirangi to protect yourself.
Sounds exhausting.
And if you meet an equal, you have to battle for dominance just to establish a baseline of communication. If I lived in that system, I would be incredibly paranoid. I wouldn't trust anyone.
And that feeling right there brings us to the fourth trait observers always cite: mistrust.
Mistrust is cited everywhere in the sociological literature. Western observers see it as an attitudinal feature, a dark psychological state where individuals believe other people are inherently unpredictable and malicious. Observers write that Iranians are paranoid, constantly expecting betrayal.
But Beeman reframes this completely, stripping the psychological malice right out of it.
Okay, how does he do that?
He argues that if we look at mistrust from the standpoint of communication rather than psychology, mistrust is simply relative communicative maladroitness.
Okay, we need to unpack relative communicative maladroitness. What does that mean in plain English?
It means that the person we are labeling as mistrustful or paranoid is in fact simply unable to interpret the actions of another person to their own satisfaction. Mistrust is the reciprocal reaction to zirangi.
Oh, I see.
If I am successfully concealing my motives from you using cleverness and you cannot figure out what game I am playing, you experience the feeling that observers call mistrust.
So when I feel mistrust in this system, I am not thinking this person is fundamentally evil and wants to destroy me. I am thinking I cannot read this person's code. They are outmaneuvering me, so I must proceed with extreme caution.
Precisely. If you operate in a situation where the communicative habit is to expect bad news to be revealed in stages like the mother waiting for the telegram, then a clear pattern of expectation for unknown actions is established.
You know you don't know everything.
You know for a fact that you do not know the whole truth. Furthermore, Beeman notes that in Iranian communication situations, obtuseness and obscurity are highly valued skills.
Obscurity is a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. You do not expect to be able to divine the motives of someone who is more zirangi, more clever than you are. Lacking a complete reading of their intentions, you simply follow the expected stages of message presentation cautiously. You don't trust them not because they are inherently bad people, but because they are better at the game than you are and you are currently losing.
There is a story in the paper about a druggist in Mashhad that illustrates this inversion of Western trust so beautifully. I want to dive deep into this because it challenges everything a Westerner thinks about business and morality.
The drug story is incredible.
Yeah, so Beeman knew a druggist in Mashhad who had a young apprentice working in his shop. The druggist kept absolutely no accounting books, no receipts, no inventory logs, nothing. Beeman, looking at this through Western eyes, asks the druggist, "Aren't you worried your apprentice is stealing money in such a lax situation?"
And the druggist's reply completely shatters the Western assumption of trust.
He says he is certain the young man is stealing money. He has never caught him red-handed. He has never even noticed a specific shortage in the till. But he knows the apprentice is stealing because, as he puts it, all apprentices steal.
Just a fact of life.
But here is where it gets wild. The druggist considered this young man the best apprentice he had ever had, not just because he was a good worker, but specifically because he stole so little, and he did it so cleverly that the owner was never able to detect it.
It is a stunning conceptual inversion.
Hmm.
In the West, trust in business is binary and moral. You either steal or you do not steal. If you steal a single penny, you are an untrustworthy, bad person and you are fired.
Right.
But in this system, the mistrust, the baseline assumption that the apprentice is siphoning off funds, is basically just an assumption of the rules of the economic game.
Let me offer some genuine pushback here. From a Western standpoint, why hire an apprentice at all if you know they are going to steal from you? Isn't that just a broken, corrupt economic system masking itself as a cultural quirk?
It seems broken if you don't understand the underlying economic structure of that specific relationship. In many traditional bazaar economies, the formal wages paid to an apprentice are incredibly low, almost nominal. The skimming of a tiny percentage of profits is tacitly understood by both parties as a supplement to those wages.
Oh, wow.
It is built into the unwritten contract. The druggist isn't losing money he didn't expect to lose.
So it's an informal profit-sharing model. But why does the druggist admire him for it?
Because of the zirangi involved. You don't dislike someone because you don't trust them, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
You dislike them if they are bad at playing the game.
So if he was bad at stealing...
Right, if an apprentice steals clumsily, if he takes too much, or leaves the till noticeably empty, forcing the owner to confront him, he has ruptured the social fabric. He is a bad apprentice because he forced an ugly, direct confrontation.
But if he's smooth about it...
If he steals with exceptional cleverness, taking just enough to survive but never enough to be noticed, he maintains the smooth, polite surface of the social interaction. He's playing his role perfectly. He is an excellent apprentice.
Beeman explicitly states that in his experience in the village, personal dislike was not closely tied to uncertainty about potential actions. People who are considered bad weren't disliked because they were untrusted. They were disliked for specific past deeds that had concrete, undeniable bad effects.
Exactly.
The background radiation of mistrust is just the accepted baseline environment of communication.
It is the cost of doing business in a highly complex social system.
Okay, I can wrap my head around the idea that trust, status, and cleverness are highly formalized communication strategies. But I have to push back on this final trait.
Okay, let's hear it.
What about raw, visceral emotion? Observers constantly claim Iranians are incredibly emotional. You can fake a smile, you can manage the truth about a report card, and you can politely skim from a cash register. But you cannot fake a hysterical, convulsing emotional breakdown. Doesn't the sheer volume and intensity of emotion prove that there is a fundamental psychological difference at play?
This is perhaps the most crucial distinction Beeman makes in the entire paper. When observers talk about the emotionality of Iranians, they are failing entirely to draw a line between emotion that is expressed and emotion that is felt.
Walk me through that distinction.
A non-Iranian observer looks at the society and concludes that the people are extremely emotional. But that conclusion is based entirely on the fact that the expression of emotion is considered appropriate in completely different contexts in Iran than it is in the West. Beeman assumes, and modern psychology supports this, that in terms of emotion, which is actually felt internally, Iranians are similar to the rest of the world's population. They feel anger, profound sadness, and joy, just like anyone else. What differs drastically is the cultural rulebook dictating when, where, and to whom you are allowed to show those feelings.
The contexts are swapped.
Yes. For example, weeping and crying by men is considered an entirely appropriate, deeply human expression in many public contexts, in Iran contexts, where it would be totally inappropriate and heavily stigmatized as weakness in the United States or Britain.
Like at a public gathering or something.
Exactly. Conversely, showing minor personal anger and petty frustration, snapping at a waiter, yelling at another driver in traffic, is something Americans do constantly in public. But Iranians are not given nearly the same range of possibility for expressing that kind of casual public frustration without severe social sanction.
So an American tourist sees an Iranian man weeping openly in a public square and thinks, these people are so emotionally volatile. But an Iranian tourist might visit New York, see an American businessman screaming at a barista over a delayed coffee order, and think, these Americans are completely out of control, they have no emotional regulation whatsoever.
Exactly. But the rulebook goes much deeper, especially regarding the structure of the family. Anger directed at certain persons, particularly one's social superiors or parents, is strictly universally condemned in Iran.
The text gives two incredibly intense, disturbing examples of what happens when that specific rule of suppression is enforced. Let's look at the story of the 7-year-old child.
Beeman relates an incident he witnessed, where a 7-year-old child, in a moment of childish frustration, struck his father in anger. The reaction from the family was absolute shock. The father didn't strike back. He simply stared in disbelief that the rule had been broken so violently. The mother immediately began to weep and wail, and the child, a 7-year-old boy, was so instantly consumed by the crushing weight of cultural remorse that he locked himself in the toilet and refused to come out for dinner.
A 7-year-old. The cultural programming regarding authority is so deep, the load-bearing walls of the family structure are so rigid that even a child that young instantly knows he has violated a massive, unforgivable communicative rule.
He was expected to contain his anger perfectly.
And the second example is even more extreme. Beeman witnessed a young man who experienced actual hysterical convulsions. Why? Because he was suppressing massive, justified anger toward his father during a tense discussion about his future bride.
He was literally tearing himself apart physically. The internal emotion was real, but the communicative rules absolutely prohibited him from expressing that anger toward his superior. The pressure had nowhere to go but inward, resulting in physical convulsions.
That's terrifying.
It is. On the other hand, the rules dictate that an insult to one's honor demands an immediate and violent expression of outward anger.
Oh.
If your honor is insulted and you do not react violently, you are behaving inappropriately. It would be seen as a profound failure of character.
This is the moment where the pieces really click together for me. Western observers walk into this culture. They see men weeping openly in public. They see violent, immediate explosions of anger over perceived insults to honor. They write down in their diaries, the Iranian national character is highly emotional, irrational, and volatile.
Right.
What they are completely missing, what is entirely invisible to them because it happens behind the closed doors of the family home or locked deep inside the minds of the individuals, is the intense, incredible suppression of emotion that is required to function in daily life.
That's a great way to put it.
They see the decorative facade where expression is allowed, but they don't see the massive, rigid, load-bearing walls of the family structure that force that emotion into specific channels.
That is a phenomenal synthesis of the dynamic. The matter of emotionality reduces entirely to a problem of assessing what kinds of messages are appropriate for expression at particular times, in particular contexts, and to particular persons.
It's not biology.
No, it is not an investigation of inherent personality traits distributed biologically throughout a population. It is an investigation of the rulebook.
Which brings us to the ultimate, overarching question of this entire deep dive. If all of this, the shifting of status, the two mayors, the zirangi, the weeping, the massive suppression of anger, is a communicative performance, why do it?
That's the big question.
Why go through all this incredible, exhausting theater? What is the actual function of this behavior in human society?
To answer that, Beeman brings in a heavy-hitting sociological concept from ethnomethodology, specifically drawing on the work of the sociologist Harold Garfinkel. It's the concept of accounting procedures. And this concept is the master key to understanding not just 1970s Iran, but human interaction everywhere.
We need to spend some time unpacking this. What is ethnomethodology and what is an accounting procedure?
Ethnomethodology is the study of how everyday people use social interaction to make sense of their world and maintain a shared sense of reality. Garfinkel observed that when individuals engage in communication, they are never just transmitting the surface-level substantive message like, pass the salt or I am angry.
Okay, what else are they transmitting?
They are simultaneously, always, transmitting meta-messages. These meta-messages constitute an account to observers and to themselves of what they are doing, what they have done, or what they are about to do.
Every action we take is wearing a little explanatory name tag.
Exactly. Every action is an account of itself. It serves as an explanation for previous actions, making them intelligible to the group, and it serves as a license for future actions.
Let me ground this with a Western example before we apply it to Iran. Think about arriving late to an important corporate meeting. If you walk in 20 minutes late, you don't just quietly sit down and start taking notes.
If you do that, people will think you are arrogant and don't care about their time.
Exactly. Instead, you perform an accounting procedure. You might walk in slightly out of breath. You might wipe imaginary sweat from your forehead. You aggressively whisper, "The traffic on the I-95 was a nightmare. There was a huge wreck."
You perform the delay.
Yes. You are performing the state of being delayed by outside forces. The form of your entry is an account that justifies your violation of the be on time rule, maintaining your status as a good employee in the eyes of the room.
That is a perfect ethnomethodological example. In this light, you cannot take anything at face value. For instance, when someone gives an autobiographical statement in an interview, they are not giving you objective historical truth. They are providing a ready-made strategy for dealing with the social interaction happening right now. They are rationalizing their ongoing situation using cultural accounts that make sense to the interviewer.
So how does Beeman apply this to the public displays of anger in Iran?
Beeman notes that when an Iranian man publicly gives vent to his anger, he cannot simply yell. Yelling alone does not justify the rupture of social peace. He must physically demonstrate to the audience that his anger is culturally appropriate for the context.
So it's a show.
So he invokes loud religious oaths. He intentionally turns red in the face. He tries to fight the person who insulted him, but he ensures that he is being securely held back by onlookers. And he loudly proclaims the specific reason for his anger to anyone who can hear.
The performance itself is the account. He is broadcasting a meta message to the crowd saying, "Look at how violently I am reacting. Look at the sacred oaths I am swearing. Look how you have to physically restrain me. This proves that the insult to my honor was severe and my anger is culturally justified."
Precisely.
He is accounting for his action in real time, so the observers don't view him as a madman, but rather as an honorable man defending his status.
And this is the profound trap that observers fall into. We cannot observe motivations, emotions, or psychological characteristics directly. They are locked inside the human skull. We can only observe the outward expressions of those private phenomena.
Right.
And those expressions are heavily organized, regularized, and dictated by broad systems of communication. These systems largely obliterate the vast differences in individual psychology so that society can function with some level of mutual intelligibility.
When a Western observer, or frankly any of us observing a corporate department or a family dynamic we don't understand, makes a judgment saying these people are naturally suspicious, or they are inherently devious, or they're far too emotional, what that observer is actually doing is failing to read the meta messages.
They're missing the whole point.
They are watching a complex accounting procedure, a cultural performance designed to navigate status, avoid pain, or justify an action, and they are taking it completely at face value. They are turning a sophisticated sociolinguistic strategy into a permanent personality trait.
As Beeman so brilliantly concludes, statements about national character may simply be our own systematic cultural accounts of the cultural accounting that native peoples employ to rationalize their own ongoing situations. It is observers watching actors perform a play, missing the subtext entirely, and confusing the script for the actor's soul.
This has been an absolutely mind-expanding deep dive into William O. Beeman's 1976 research. We have journeyed from the persistent illusion of national character through the observer's trap of misreading the Russian swaddling into the shifting dialectic realities of the village with two Kadkudas.
It's been a ride.
We've seen how zirangi is used as a tool to manage emotional fallout, like the student softening the blow of his high school failure. We've explored the rigid hierarchies of status and taruf, reframed mistrust as a simple awareness of the rules of the game with the mashadribist, and finally understood that the public theater of emotion is all part of a massive societal accounting procedure.
It serves as a profound, enduring reminder that the feel of a society or any group is a reflection of its communicative codes, not its collective psychology.
Which brings me to a final thought for you to take with you. Throughout this deep dive, we've talked about physical travelers, people crossing borders in the 1970s and encountering different speech communities in village squares or city bazaars. But think about the world we live in today. Think about the internet.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Every time you open a social media app, you are forcing thousands of vastly different, highly localized speech communities into a single, flattened digital room. We are constantly observing people performing accounting procedures designed for their specific subculture, but we are reading them through the coordinates of our own.
And judging them for it.
We see a tweet, a video, or a comment, and we instantly diagnose a psychological flaw or a moral failing in a stranger, when in reality we are just functionally illiterate in their speech community. The next time you find yourself stereotyping a group of people, whether it's online, the lazy department on the third floor of your company, or the cold family of your partner, stop. Ask yourself, what cultural accounts are they performing right now that you are completely misreading? Because if you can learn to see the code instead of the caricature, you will realize the world isn't full of defective personalities. It is just full of different rules. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.